They told you Buddhism was about peace, about silence, about sitting cross-legged on a mountain and breathing through your pain. They sold you the incense version, the soft, Instagram-friendly spirituality, where everything is love and light and letting go. But here's what they never told you. Buddha had something to say about women, something direct, something uncomfortable, something so raw that for centuries monks weren't allowed to discuss it openly. Not because it was shameful, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. Because once a man truly understands what Buddha saw, what he observed, documented, and warned about, something shifts inside him permanently. And that shift is terrifying to a world built on keeping men chasing. So they buried it, they softened it, they wrapped it in Sanskrit and locked it behind monastery walls. And meanwhile, you kept suffering, kept chasing, kept wondering why, no matter how much you gave, how hard you tried, how completely you handed yourself over, it was never enough. This isn't a hit piece on women. Understand that from the start. Buddha didn't hate women. He didn't fear them. He saw them clearly. And that clarity, that cold, precise, unblinking clarity, is exactly what most men are never allowed to develop, because a man who sees clearly doesn't chase blindly, and a man who doesn't chase blindly is a man the world loses its grip on. So let's talk about what Buddha actually said, and more importantly, why it was hidden from you. Buddha was born a prince. Siddhartha Gautama grew up inside the ultimate male fantasy: wealth, status, a beautiful wife, a son, comfort so complete that suffering had literally been kept outside the palace walls by royal decree. His father built an entire illusion around him, surrounded him with beauty, removed every trace of pain, and for a time, it worked. Siddhartha lived inside the dream that most men are still trying to build: the perfect life, the perfect woman, the perfect image of what happiness is supposed to look like. And then one day, he walked outside, and the dream collapsed, not because the world was cruel, but because it was real. He saw an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering monk. 4 sights, 4 truths. And in that moment, everything he had been given, the wife, the palace, the comfort, the illusion, it all revealed itself for what it was: a beautiful cage, a constructed reality designed to keep him from asking the one question that could set him free. What is actually true? He left. He walked away from the palace, from his wife, from his son, from every comfort he had ever known, not out of hate, not out of bitterness, but out of a burning need to understand what was real underneath all the performance, all the projection, all the attachment. And what he found after years of searching, after fasting and meditating and sitting under the Bodhi tree until the answers cracked open inside him, was this: suffering doesn't come from the world. It comes from attachment to a version of the world that doesn't exist. Read that again. Suffering doesn't come from her leaving. It doesn't come from rejection. It doesn't come from being cheated on or abandoned or replaced. It comes from your attachment to the illusion of who she was, to the story you built around her, to the fantasy you projected onto a human being who is always, always something different than what you needed her to be. Buddha called this Maya, illusion, the veil that sits between you and reality. And here's what no one tells you about Maya. It's not something she puts over your eyes. You build it yourself, brick by brick, every time you look at a woman and see your salvation instead of a person. Every time you feel that electricity and call it love when what it really is recognition. You're recognizing the shape of something you've been missing inside yourself, and you're projecting it onto her like a film onto a blank screen. She didn't create the movie. You did. And this is precisely what Buddha saw, precisely what made his teachings so threatening to comfortable men and comfortable societies. Because if a man truly understands that his suffering comes from his own attachment, his own projection, his own constructed illusion, then he can't blame her anymore. He can't stay angry. He can't keep chasing. He has to turn around and face the one thing he has been running from his entire life: himself. That's the teaching they didn't want you to hear, not because it's cruel, not because it's misogynistic, but because it's the most direct path to a freedom that makes you completely ungovernable. A man who is seen through his own illusions cannot be manipulated through his longing, cannot be controlled through his loneliness, cannot be redirected through the promise of female approval. And that kind of man, calm, grounded, self-possessed, free, that kind of man is dangerous to every system built on keeping you hungry, so they kept it quiet. But now you're hearing it. And by the end of this, you won't be able to unhear it. You've felt it before. That moment when you first saw her and something inside you lit up like a current running through wire. You told yourself it was chemistry. You told yourself it was connection. You told yourself, maybe this one is different. But here's the question Buddha would ask you, sitting across from you in that silence that cuts deeper than any argument. What exactly did you fall in love with? Not who. What? Because if you slow it down, if you actually stop and examine what happened in those first hours, those first days, you'll find something uncomfortable waiting for you underneath the feeling. You didn't fall in love with her. You fell in love with a version of her that existed almost entirely inside your own mind. You took fragments, a smile, the way she looked at you, a laugh, a moment of vulnerability she let you see. And from those fragments, you built an entire person, a complete human being with depth and loyalty and understanding and warmth, all constructed from almost nothing, all assembled in the dark rooms of your own longing. Buddha had a word for this, Maya. In Sanskrit, Maya doesn't just mean illusion. It means the creative power that generates the appearance of reality. It's the force that makes the constructed world feel more real than what's actually there. And Buddha taught that Maya is not something that happens to you. It's something you participate in, actively, enthusiastically, especially when you're in love, because the mind doesn't fall in love with people. The mind falls in love with projections, with possibilities, with the feeling of finally being understood, finally being chosen, finally being enough. Feelings that have nothing to do with her and everything to do with the wounds you walked in with before she ever entered the room. Think about the last time your heart broke and be honest with yourself here. When it ended, when she left, or drifted, or showed you a side of herself that shattered the image, what exactly were you grieving? Was it her? Was it the actual human being who had her own fears, her own contradictions, her own private darkness you barely knew? Or were you grieving something else? The version of her you had built, the future you had imagined, the feeling she gave you that you were terrified to lose. You weren't mourning a person, you were mourning a dream. And that dream, that exquisitely painful dream, was yours. You authored it, you directed it, you cast her in the lead role of a story she never auditioned for. That's Maya, and it's running your life. Buddha saw this with a clarity that took him years of isolation to develop. He understood that the human mind is a projection machine. It takes the raw, messy, ambiguous data of reality and instantly converts it into a narrative, a story, a meaning. And nowhere is this more powerful, more consuming, more completely destructive than in the territory of love and desire, because desire doesn't want truth. Desire wants confirmation. It wants the feeling to keep going. It wants the projection to hold. And so the mind cooperates. It filters out the signals that don't fit the story. It amplifies the ones that do. It builds an entire emotional architecture on a foundation of selected fragments, and then calls it intimacy. This is why relationships that begin with the most intense feeling so often collapse the hardest, because the intensity was never about the depth of the connection. It was about the depth of the projection. The more powerful the Maya, the more devastating its collapse. You weren't falling deeper in love. You were falling deeper into your own dream. And dreams always end. Here's where it gets even more precise. Buddha taught that Maya operates through the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And in the context of romantic love, delusion is the engine that runs everything else. You enter a relationship already deluded about who she is. You construct a version of her that satisfies your deepest needs, and when she inevitably fails to be that version because she's a human being, not a projection, the delusion fractures. And what fills the fracture? Greed. Wanting more, trying harder, performing better, giving everything just to get that feeling back. And when that fails, hatred. At her, at yourself, at love itself. The entire cycle, falling, clinging, losing, suffering, runs on Maya from the very beginning. And here's what makes this teaching so difficult to swallow. Buddha isn't saying she's the problem. He's saying the problem is older than her, deeper than her, more intimate than anything she ever did or didn't do. The problem is the unexamined mind that walks into every room already dreaming, already projecting, already building cathedrals out of first impressions and calling them love. You cannot love what you cannot see clearly. And you cannot see clearly while Maya is running the show. That's not a condemnation. That's a diagnosis. And unlike the kind of pain you've been sitting with, the kind that has no explanation, no logic, no way through, a diagnosis has a door in it, and in the next block, we're going to find it. You've watched it happen. Maybe more than once. Maybe enough times that you've started to wonder if there's something wrong with you. She was warm, then cold, present, then distant, certain about you, then suddenly uncertain about everything. And you did what men do. You searched for the reason. You replayed conversations. You audited your behavior. You asked yourself what you changed, what you did wrong, what invisible line you crossed without knowing it existed. But what if you didn't cross any line? What if what you were witnessing had nothing to do with you at all? Buddha spent years studying the nature of reality before he taught a single word, and one of the foundational pillars of everything he discovered, the thing that sits underneath all his other teachings like bedrock, is this: nothing is permanent. Not one single thing in this universe holds its form forever. Flowers die, mountains erode, rivers change course, seasons turn without asking your permission, and people shift, cycle, transform, and move on with the same inevitability as weather. In Pali, the language of the earliest Buddhist texts, this principle is called anicca, impermanence. And Buddha didn't teach it as philosophy. He taught it as survival, because the man who truly understands impermanence stops building his entire emotional life on the assumption that anything, any feeling, any person, any connection will stay the same. Now apply that to her. What you experienced wasn't betrayal. What you experienced was impermanence doing exactly what impermanence does. She wasn't lying when she said she loved you. She wasn't performing when she made you feel like the only man in the room. In that moment, it was real. But real doesn't mean permanent. Real doesn't mean fixed. Real doesn't mean the feeling that existed on a Tuesday in March will still exist in the same form by summer, because she is not a statue. She is not a monument. She is a living, shifting, constantly evolving human being, and every single thing inside her is subject to the same law of impermanence that governs everything else in this universe. Her feelings changed, not because you failed, because feelings are impermanent. Her certainty dissolved, not because you weren't enough, because certainty is impermanent. Her attraction fluctuated, not because you did something wrong, because attraction, like every other human experience, rises and falls like tide, like breath, like everything that is alive. But here is where men lose themselves. Here is the exact point where suffering enters. You knew somewhere underneath the feeling that things were shifting. You sensed the tide going out. And instead of accepting what was happening, instead of standing on the shore with open hands like Buddha taught, you grabbed, you held tighter, you started performing harder, loving louder, making yourself smaller or bigger or whatever shape you thought might make her stay. You tried to freeze the river, to pin down the tide, to make permanent what was always going to move. And Buddha would look at you in that moment, not with judgment, but with complete recognition, and say this is where all suffering is born, not in the loss itself, in the refusal to accept that loss was always possible, in the belief that if you loved correctly, if you behaved correctly, if you were enough, the impermanent could somehow be made to last. That belief is the trap, and most men live inside it their entire lives. Here's what makes this harder. Women by nature are often more attuned to their own internal shifts than men are. They feel the change in themselves before you do. They sense the tide turning in their own emotions while you're still standing in the sun thinking everything is fine. And because they feel it first, they begin the internal process of detachment while you're still fully attached. This creates the experience that drives men to madness, the slow withdrawal, the increasing distance, the warmth that starts to cool at a pace too gradual to name, but too real to ignore. You felt it and you pushed back, because no one taught you what Buddha taught his monks in the earliest days of his community, that the correct response to impermanence is not resistance, it is presence, full, clear-eyed, unattached presence. the ability to be completely in an experience while holding the knowledge that the experience will change. To love without requiring that love to be permanent in order to be real. To be with someone fully without constructing your entire identity around whether they stay. This is not coldness. Understand that. Buddha's teaching on impermanence is not an instruction to feel less. It is an instruction to stop lying to yourself about the nature of what you feel and where you're placing it. The man who understands impermanence doesn't love less. He loves without the desperation that poisons everything it touches. He doesn't need her to stay to prove the love was real. He doesn't need the relationship to last forever to justify what he felt. He can hold the experience, all of it, the warmth, the depth, the connection, without demanding that reality freeze itself in place to protect his comfort. And here is the brutal paradox that Buddha saw clearly and modern men almost never grasp. The man who accepts impermanence becomes the most magnetic force in any room, because he's the only one not clinging, not performing, not desperately trying to maintain a version of reality that the universe is already moving past. He is still, he is grounded, he is present in a way that the desperate clinging, freezing the river man can never be. And she feels that. She feels the difference between a man who loves her and a man who needs her to stay in order to survive. One feels like freedom, the other feels like a wall. Impermanence isn't your enemy. Your refusal to accept it is. There is a teaching in Buddhism that almost never makes it into the Western self-help version of the philosophy. It gets cut out of the podcasts, skipped in the meditation apps, glossed over in the mindfulness courses that promise you calm and clarity and a better morning routine. It's called the 3 poisons. And Buddha didn't call them poisons by accident. He called them that because they don't announce themselves. They don't come in loud and obvious, wearing signs around their necks. They seep in slowly, quietly, through the cracks in your emotional armor until they're running so much of your behavior that you can't tell where they end and where you begin. You think you're acting from love. You think you're acting from loyalty, from devotion, from the deepest parts of who you are. But underneath the story you're telling yourself, one of the 3 poisons is almost always at the wheel. The first poison is raga, craving, greed. The desperate consuming hunger for something outside yourself to fill the space inside you that feels hollow. The second is devesha, aversion, hatred, the hard wall that goes up when craving is denied, the anger, the bitterness, the need to destroy what you can't possess. And the third, the one that makes the other 2 possible, the one that Buddha called the root of all suffering, is moha, delusion, the fundamental inability to see reality as it actually is. Now stop thinking about Buddhism for a moment. Think about the last relationship that broke you. Walk yourself back through it honestly. Not the version you tell other people. The version you know is true at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep and the silence gets loud. In the beginning, there was craving, and you dressed it up as love because that's what men do. You told yourself you wanted her. But what you actually wanted, what the craving was really reaching for, was the feeling she gave you. The feeling of being chosen, of being enough, of having something warm and alive in your corner in a world that mostly feels indifferent. You weren't hungry for her. You were hungry for what she represented: safety, validation, proof that you were worth wanting. And that hunger, that deep, unexamined, ravenous hunger drove everything that came after, because raga doesn't stop at wanting. It escalates. It needs more of what temporarily satisfied it. So you texted more, called more, showed up more, made yourself more available, more accommodating, more willing to fold your own needs into whatever shape she seemed to require. Not because you were generous, because the craving demanded it. Because every moment she seemed pleased with you fed the hunger for just long enough that you needed to feed it again. You weren't building a relationship, you were managing an addiction. And like every addiction, the doses had to keep increasing while the returns kept diminishing. And then something shifted. Maybe she pulled back. Maybe she changed. Maybe the version of her you had projected started cracking at the edges, and the real, complicated, fully human person underneath began to show. And the craving, unable to get what it needed, converted. This is what Buddha understood that almost no one talks about. Raga and devesha are the same energy wearing different masks. Craving and hatred are not opposites. They are the same force, flipped. The man who wanted her most becomes the man who resents her most when the wanting goes unsatisfied. You didn't become bitter because she was cruel. You became bitter because your craving hit a wall. That's devesha, and it is everywhere in the way men talk about women after things fall apart. The anger that lives in forums and group chats and late-night conversations between men who've been hurt. The declarations that women are this way or that way, that they're incapable of loyalty, that they're fundamentally broken. That's not insight. That's raga in a trench coat. That's craving that got denied, flipped into aversion, and now calls itself wisdom. But here's the deepest layer, the one Buddha put at the center of everything. Both the craving and the hatred are only possible because of moha, because of delusion, because from the very first moment, you weren't seeing clearly. You were seeing through the filter of everything you needed her to be. Your wounds shaped your perception before she ever said a word. Your childhood taught you what love looks like, what it costs, what you have to perform to earn it. And you walked into every relationship carrying that programming like a set of instructions written in a language you didn't even know you were reading. Moha made you see the projection instead of the person. Raga made you hunger for the projection with everything you had. And devesha rose up the moment the projection failed to hold. You were never reacting to her. You were reacting to the collision between your illusion and reality. And here is the part that requires real courage to sit with. The three poisons are not character flaws. They are not proof that you are broken or weak or beyond repair. Buddha taught that every unawakened human being operates from them. Every single one. The man who thinks he has escaped them is usually the most deeply captured. The poisons don't disappear through denial. They don't dissolve through distraction or discipline, or burying yourself in work, or deciding that women aren't worth the trouble. They dissolve through one thing only, seeing them clearly for what they are, not fighting them, not shaming yourself for having them, but sitting in the discomfort of honest recognition and saying, this is craving, this is aversion, this is delusion, this is what's actually driving me right now, underneath the story I'm telling myself about love. That moment of recognition, that clear-eyed, unflinching, brutally honest moment is what Buddha called the beginning of the path, not the end of suffering, the beginning of the end. And the next question is the one that changes everything. If the poisons are running your relationships, what does a man look like when he starts to drain them? There is a moment in the life of every man who has been through enough loss, enough rejection, enough cycles of craving and collapse, when a question surfaces that he's never been willing to ask out loud. What if I'm the problem? Not in the way the world tells you, not the self-flagellating, apologize for existing version of that question that modern culture tries to sell you. Not the performance of accountability that men put on to seem evolved, to seem safe, to seem like the kind of man who gets chosen next time. The real version, the quiet, uncomfortable, sits in your chest version, the one that doesn't want an audience, the one that asks, genuinely, without defense, what is inside me that keeps generating this same experience? Buddha had a word for the work required to answer that question honestly. Bhavana, cultivation. The deliberate, patient, unglamorous practice of developing the mind from the inside out. Not fixing your external circumstances, not upgrading your status or your appearance or your social performance, not becoming a better actor in the same play, cultivating something real underneath all of it, something that doesn't depend on her approval to stand, something that doesn't crumble when she leaves, something that was there before she arrived and will be there long after. This is what they meant by the path of the monk. And before you dismiss it, before your mind goes to shaved heads and orange robes and celibacy, understand what the path actually is at its core. It is not a rejection of women. It is not a wall built against desire. It is not hatred wearing the costume of discipline. The path of the monk, in its truest form, is simply this: a man choosing himself completely, not as a reaction to being hurt, not as a strategy to attract, as a fundamental reorientation of where he places his center. Most men place their center outside themselves. This is the root of everything. You place your center in her approval, in her attraction, in the feeling of being chosen by someone you desire. And when that external center holds, life feels meaningful. When it shifts, when she withdraws, when the relationship ends, when rejection arrives, the center collapses and you collapse with it. because there was never anything inside to hold you up. There was only the borrowed stability of her presence. Buddha watched this pattern with the precision of a man who had lived inside the palace version of it. He had the ultimate external center: wealth, status, a devoted wife, a perfect constructed life, and he walked away from all of it. Not because those things were evil, not because he hated Yashodhara, his wife, but because he understood something that required the courage of a man who had everything to admit. No external condition, not the most beautiful woman, not the most perfect life, not the deepest love, can give you what you are looking for, because what you are actually looking for cannot be found outside. It was never out there. It was always in here. The monk's path begins the moment a man stops outsourcing his wholeness. The moment he stops treating a woman like a missing piece and starts doing the terrifying, unglamorous, completely unsexy work of becoming whole on his own terms. Not whole as in perfect, not whole as in without need, whole as in rooted, grounded, in possession of a center that the world can push against without toppling. And here is what that actually looks like in practice. Because this is where teachings get vague and men get lost in abstraction. It looks like sitting in discomfort without immediately reaching for something to soothe it, without texting her, without opening another app, without filling the silence with noise. It looks like developing the capacity to be alone, truly alone, not just physically alone while mentally orbiting around her, without that aloneness feeling like punishment. It looks like building something, not to impress anyone, not to become more attractive, but because you have a vision inside you that is yours, that belongs to no one else, that will exist whether she validates it or not. It looks like having standards that don't bend when she pushes against them, not because you're rigid, not because you're cruel, but because you know what you are and you refuse to pretend otherwise in exchange for access to her warmth. This is not the monk's path as deprivation. This is the monk's path as liberation, because here is what Buddha observed and what men who have walked through enough fire eventually discover for themselves. The neediness doesn't make her stay. It makes her leave. Not because women are cruel, because neediness is a signal. It signals that you have outsourced your center, that you are fragile in a way that makes you unreliable as a partner, as a man, as a presence. The signal she receives from a man whose world collapses without her is not love. It is weight. And no woman, no matter how much she cares about you, can carry the weight of a man who refuses to carry himself. The monk doesn't make himself cold. He makes himself complete. And completion, real completion, not the performed version, is the most quietly powerful thing a man can bring into a room. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It doesn't need to. It simply sits in its own gravity and lets everything else arrange itself around it. Buddha left the palace not to escape love. He left to become someone capable of it. Someone who could be fully present in any experience without being destroyed when it ended. Someone who could give without demanding the gift be returned in a specific form. Someone who had faced the void inside himself and discovered it wasn't void at all. That discovery is available to every man willing to stop running long enough to make it. The question is not whether you are capable of the monk's path. The question is whether you are tired enough of the alternative. You made it here, and that means something. Not everyone does. Most men hear the first uncomfortable truth and close the tab. They feel the sting of recognition and reach for something easier. Another video, another distraction, another woman to project onto so the cycle can begin again with fresh hope and a clean slate. Because starting over feels like progress. Because the feeling of new possibility is easier to sit with than the work of real change. But you're still here, which means something in you already knows that what you've been doing isn't working, knows that the pattern is real, knows that the suffering isn't bad luck or the wrong women or timing or any of the other stories men tell themselves in the gap between one relationship and the next. Something in you has been trying to tell you the truth for a long time, and you've been almost ready to hear it. This is what Buddha called the moment before Bodhi, the moment before awakening, not the awakening itself. That comes with work, with time, with the slow and unglamorous practice of turning inward and staying there long enough for the illusions to dissolve on their own. But the moment before, the moment when a man becomes willing, when the pain of staying asleep finally outweighs the comfort of the dream, you are at that moment right now. So here is what awakening actually looks like for a man in the modern world. Not in a monastery, not in retreat, not in some idealized version of spiritual life that requires you to abandon everything and sit under a tree. Here, in your life, with your history and your wounds and your patterns and your particular brand of suffering that you've been carrying around so long, it started to feel like personality. Awakening begins with a single shift in orientation. Instead of asking what is wrong with her, you start asking what is happening in me, not as punishment, not as self-blame, but as genuine inquiry, the kind that a scientist brings to an experiment. Curious, open, without a predetermined answer, you stop prosecuting her and you start investigating yourself. And what you find there, when you look honestly, is not ugliness. It is not confirmation that you are broken beyond repair. What you find is a man who was never taught to look inward. A man who was handed a set of external targets, success, status, the right woman, the right life, and told that hitting those targets would produce the feeling he was actually searching for, and who discovered, after enough attempts, that it never quite did. That discovery is not failure. That discovery is the beginning, because the man who has stopped believing that she holds the answer is the man who is finally free to find it, and where Buddha said the answer lives. Where every contemplative tradition across every culture in human history has pointed is inward, in the cultivation of a self so grounded, so clear, so genuinely at home in its own existence, that the presence or absence of external validation stops being an existential question and becomes simply information. She's interested. Good. She's not. Also good. He moves accordingly from his own center without the frantic recalculation of a man whose worth depends on the outcome. This is what Bodhi produces. Not a man without desire, not a man without feeling, not a cold, detached, unreachable statue that women bounce off and walk away from confused. A man with full access to his emotional life who is not enslaved by it. A man who can feel the pull of attraction without being dragged by it. Who can experience rejection without being defined by it? Who can love genuinely, deeply with his whole chest without needing that love to be returned in a specific form in order to remain standing? That man is rare, genuinely rare. And here is the paradox that Buddha understood and that every man who has done this work eventually discovers for himself. That man, the grounded one, the clear one, the one who needs nothing from her, is the one she feels most drawn toward, not because he is performing unavailability, not because he is running a strategy, but because his presence carries something that the desperate, craving, clinging man can never manufacture. Gravity, real gravity, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that simply is. Women feel this the way you feel temperature when you walk into a room. Without thinking about it, without analyzing it, it arrives before the words do. Before the looks, before the conversation, before any of the external signals men spend years trying to optimize. They feel whether a man is at home in himself or auditioning for permission to exist. And the man who is home, truly home, not performing it, not having read about it, but having actually done the work of arriving there, that man changes the entire dynamic of every interaction he enters. Not because he is trying to, because he can't help it, because the ground he stands on is real. This is what was hidden in the Buddha's teaching. Not hatred of women, not instructions to withdraw or wall off or treat relationships as a battlefield. An invitation, the most demanding, most rewarding, most completely transformative invitation a man can accept. Come home to yourself first, not because she isn't worth wanting, but because you are worth knowing. Because the man on the other side of this work, the man who has faced his cravings and his aversions and his delusions and his projections and his borrowed identity and his outsourced worth, that man has something to offer that no performance, no strategy, no self-improvement program can manufacture. He has himself, fully, without apology, without condition, and that right there is the only foundation on which anything real can be built. Buddha didn't want you to hear this because the world profits from your hunger, from your craving, from the version of you that keeps chasing, keeps performing, keeps searching outside for what only exists inside. But now you've heard it, and you already know what comes next.